AD 60, Eastern Britain. In the courtyard of a royal compound that 3 weeks ago belonged to a king, Roman lictors drag a tall, red-haired woman toward a wooden post in the open ground. Her tunic is already torn from her shoulders. A centurion lifts a flexible rod. The woman is Boudica, queen of the Iceni, widow of King Prasutagus. Mother of the 2 girls Roman soldiers are at this moment pushing through the door of an outbuilding behind her. The door closes. What is about to happen inside that building does not need to be narrated. It is documented in 2 short sentences by a Roman historian named Tacitus, writing 50 years later in the imperial archives, who does not soften it and does not look away from it. In the courtyard, the centurion brings the rod down. The queen does not cry out. The crowd of Iceni nobles, forced to stand and watch, does not move, because Roman soldiers behind the crowd are watching the crowd. At the edge of the yard, Roman clerks are already counting cattle. A procurator's bookkeeper is calling out numbers from a wax tablet, while the rod comes down a second time. This was supposed to be the day Prasutagus's will was read. Within a year, the woman tied to this post will burn 3 Roman cities to the ground. Camulodunum, Londinium, Verulamium, she will leave 70,000 bodies in the streets of those cities. The Roman governor will run out of his own province. The 9th Legion will be ambushed and broken in open country. And the empire that ordered this flogging will come closer to losing Britain than at any point in its first century there. This is what they did to her first. To get to that courtyard, the procurator's men had to travel out of Londinium for 4 days. The man who ordered it was named Catus Decianus, an equestrian financial officer, procurator of Britain, whose job, under the Emperor Nero, was to extract money from the new province. The Roman governor, the senior military commander of Britain, was 400 miles away, on the island the Romans called Mona, modern Anglesey, leading 2 legions through the surf against the last Druid stronghold in Britain. Tacitus describes that campaign in detail. Suetonius Paulinus, the governor, was watching his soldiers cut down white-robed priests on a beach while Catus Decianus rode east with a column of armed men toward the Iceni heartland in what is now Norfolk. Prasutagus had died in late spring. He had been a client king of Rome for nearly 20 years, ruling the Iceni under a treaty that recognized his throne in exchange for tribute and loyalty. He had no surviving son. He had 2 daughters. He had written a will that he believed would protect them. Half his kingdom and his personal wealth went to his 2 daughters. The other half went directly to the Emperor Nero, not to Rome, to Nero personally by name. Prasutagus believed that making the emperor a co-heir alongside his daughters would tie the kingdom's survival to the emperor's interest. It was a calculated act of legal protection by a dying man who knew what Rome did to undefended client kingdoms. The will did not protect them. Catus Decianus did not recognize it. To him, a client kingdom without a male heir was a kingdom that had reverted to Rome. The daughters were legally invisible. The personal property of the royal household was, under his reading, the personal property of the Roman state. And the loans that Roman financiers had pushed onto the Iceni nobility in the previous decade, secured against their lands, were now callable. The clerks declared the inventory. Iceni nobles who protested were stripped of their hereditary estates on the spot. The senior men who pressed the case were seized as slaves. And then the queen was brought out into the courtyard, and the daughters were brought out, and the wooden post was set up in front of the entire household. The flogging began. Inside the closed building, the rape of the daughters began. The 2 acts were happening in the same minute, in the same compound, within sight and sound of one another, in front of the entire Iceni nobility. This was not a punishment. There was no trial. There was no charge. Tacitus is explicit. The procurator was not enforcing law. He was demonstrating, in front of an audience of subject nobility, what client kingship under Rome was now actually worth. The flogging was the demonstration. The rape was the demonstration. The cattle being counted in the yard was the demonstration. The point was to make the lesson permanent. When it was finished, the column rode out with the cattle, the slaves, and the gold from the royal hall. They left the queen alive. They left the daughters alive. They had no instructions about either of them, and they did not appear to consider that either of them mattered. This is the mistake that ends a Roman province. Crimson Historians is the channel where the stories Rome wrote down, and then hoped no one would read, get told back to the camera. Subscribe if you want the rest of this one, and the next one after it. The history is here, the names of the dead are here, the buildings they burned, and the layer they left under the ground are here. Stay with us. In the months after the flogging, riders went out of the Iceni heartland in every direction. The Iceni nobility had nothing left to lose. Their queen had been scourged, their princesses had been raped, their hereditary estates had been declared forfeit. The men who had been seized as slaves were already on a road south to the markets of Gaul. The procurator's column was back in Londinium, counting coin. The riders went first to the Trinovantes, the tribe immediately to the south, whose lands had been confiscated a decade earlier to settle Roman army veterans at a place called Camulodunum. The Trinovantes had been forced to pay for the construction of a stone temple to the deified Emperor Claudius on land that had once been theirs. The temple was the largest classical structure in Britain. It was a cult centre dedicated to a god the Trinovantes had not chosen and could not afford. The riders found a tribe ready to march. By autumn, AD 60, Boudica had an army. Cassius Dio, writing 150 years later, gives the number as 120,000. The figure is almost certainly inflated. The army was nevertheless enormous, and it had a single-named target. Camulodunum had no walls. It was a colonia of retired Roman soldiers, their families, Trinovantes labourers, Roman administrators, and the merchants who served them. Its defences had been pulled down years earlier because the senior veterans had thought walls were a sign of fear. Its strongest building was the Temple of Claudius. Its only military presence was a thin garrison of aging veterans and the staff of the temple priesthood. When the warning came that the Iceni were marching, the veterans sent to Catus Decianus in Londinium for help. Decianus, the man who had ordered the flogging, sent 200 soldiers. They arrived without proper armour. Tacitus records this without comment. He does not need to interpret it. The man who lit the fire sent a bucket and went back to his ledger. Boudica's army came into Camulodunum from the north. The town's wooden houses caught quickly. The Roman administrators ran. The veterans ran. The garrison was overwhelmed in the streets. Tacitus records that the women and children were not spared. Within hours, the last surviving defenders, perhaps 2,000 of them, retreated to the only stone building large enough to hold them, the Temple of Claudius. The cult building the Trinovantes had been forced to fund, the marble platform that had been the symbol of Roman power in Britain. They barricaded the doors. They held for 2 days. On the second day, the Britons piled material around the temple and set it alight. The marble cracked in the heat. The roof timbers burned through. The defenders inside burned with them. The screams from inside the temple were the last sound from inside Camulodunum. The bronze head of an imperial statue, long thought to be the Emperor Claudius, and now identified by the British Museum as probably Nero, was hacked from the neck of its body during the destruction. It was carried away by the victorious Britons. It would not be seen again for 1900 years. Boudica did not attack a fort, she attacked a temple. The first target of the revolt was not a military installation, but the cultural monument the conquered tribe had been forced to fund as a tribute to its conquerors. The symbol burned for 2 days. The procurator who had ordered the flogging that started the revolt was 3 days away in Londinium packing. This is the point in the story where it becomes necessary to talk about who wrote it down. Almost everything that survives about Boudica comes from 2 Roman sources. The first is Tacitus, writing in his annals around AD 109, roughly 50 years after the events. Tacitus's father-in-law, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, served as a young military tribune in Britain during the revolt itself and would later return as governor. Agricola was an eyewitness, and he was almost certainly one of Tacitus's primary sources. Tacitus is restrained. He describes the flogging of Boudica and the rape of her daughters in 2 clipped sentences. He calls Catus Decianus's actions provocation. He treats the British response as understandable. He gives the 70,000 figure for total dead across the 3 cities, and he records that no prisoners were taken and no ransoms accepted. He does not romanticize Boudica, but he does not defend Rome either. The second source is Cassius Dio, writing his Roman history around AD 200 to 230, more than 150 years after the revolt. Dio worked from sources we no longer have. He is the one who supplies the details modern readers know best. The British army numbering 120,000, Boudica giving a long speech invoking a war goddess named Andraste, Roman women's breasts cut off and sewn into their mouths, bodies impaled in sacred groves, sacrifices to Andraste in the woods outside Londinium. The most famous passages about Boudica in popular memory are Dio's. Some of this is propaganda. Dio was writing for an imperial Roman audience and emphasizing the barbarity of the rebellion served a political purpose. Some of it is probably real. The Iceni and Trinovantes were not gentle in victory, and the sacred groves were real places where ritual killings did happen. What both sources agree on is the cause: the procurator's seizure, the flogging, the rape of the daughters, the stripping of Iceni nobles' hereditary estates. Rome's own historians, writing for Roman audiences, recorded that Rome did this and that the burning of 3 cities was the answer. The empire did not invent a different cause. It admitted the cause. What neither source records is the names of the 2 daughters. They appear in Prasutagus's will. They appear at the flogging. They are violated inside the building, behind their mother, and then the record closes on them. They have no names in any surviving Roman or British text. They are present only as the cause and absent only as the consequence. Suetonius Paulinus received the news on Mona. He turned around and rode south with what cavalry he had. His 2 legions, the 14th and parts of the 20th, followed behind on foot. He covered the distance from Anglesey to the outskirts of Londinium in days. He arrived ahead of his army. What he found was a city of perhaps 30,000 people on the north bank of the Thames, with no defensive wall, no garrison, and Boudica's army less than a week behind him. Londinium was not a Roman colonia. It was a trading settlement, a financial centre, the place where the Roman commercial network in Britain had its warehouses, its ledgers, its merchant houses, its docks. It was where Catus Decianus had his office. It was where the loans the procurator had called in had been processed. It was where the cattle taken from the Iceni had been valued and resold. The merchants in Londinium were the visible face of the system that had broken open the Iceni royal compound 3 months earlier. They were also, most of them, unarmed. Suetonius stood on the riverbank and made a decision. He could not hold Londinium. His legions were still on the road. The city had no walls. Boudica's army outnumbered his own force by perhaps 10 to 1. He had a province to save, and a city without defences could not be saved. He ordered Londinium abandoned. Those who could walk, ride, or run were allowed to leave, with his column going north. Tacitus records the rest in a single sentence. Those who could not, the old, the women, the merchants tied to their stock, the sick, the slaves, the children, were left where they stood. Boudica's army crossed the Thames in the night and came into the city from the south. The wharves went first, the warehouses along the riverbank went next. The thatched roofs of the merchant district caught one after another along the line of what is now Gracechurch Street. The smoke pulled west on the river wind. The fires burned hot enough to fuse clay into a layer of reddish glass that geologists still pull out of the ground beneath central London. Tacitus is brief and specific. No prisoners taken, no ransoms accepted. Cassius Dio is longer and graphic. Bodies in the river. Bodies hanging in the sacred grove outside the city. The killing went house by house, street by street, for an entire day. Of the 30,000 inhabitants of Londinium, the Roman sources record almost no survivors. Suetonius made a military decision. He saved his province by accepting the destruction of its largest commercial centre. Boudica made a different decision. She did not destroy a garrison, she destroyed a place. Londinium was where the Roman financial machine that had priced and sold her kingdom had its offices. She burned the warehouses, she burned the ledgers, and she burned the men who held them. The point was not military victory. The point was the place itself. After Londinium, she turned north. The road took her to Verulamium, modern St. Albans, a Roman municipium populated largely by Romanized Britons who had cast their lot with the empire. Verulamium burned the same way Londinium had. The burn layer at St. Albans is up to 50 centimeters thick at the central insula. The same fused clay, the same melted glass, the same absence of survivors. By the time Suetonius's full army caught up with her, 3 cities had been turned into ash, and the road north of Verulamium was lined with the slow column of British wagons carrying loot and families, and the bodies that hadn't been left in the streets. Suetonius chose his ground carefully. The exact location is lost. Modern historians have argued for sites in the West Midlands, near a place called Mansetta, but no archaeological evidence has settled the question. What Tacitus describes is a narrow defile, woods at the Roman rear, a tight front that Boudica's larger force could not flank, an open ground in front that would funnel her army straight onto the Roman line. Suetonius had perhaps 10,000 legionaries, the men of the 14th and the survivors of the 20th, plus auxiliary cavalry. Boudica had something between 30,000 and 200,000, depending on which ancient source you read. Behind her army, drawn up in a long line at the rear of the open ground, she had ordered her wagons placed so that the families of the warriors could watch the victory. Tacitus quotes a speech for her before the battle. The speech is Tacitus's composition, not Boudica's words, but the situation is real, and the speech survives because Tacitus thought it was the kind of speech she would have given. She stood in a chariot. Her daughters were beside her, alive at this moment, named for the last time only as her daughters. She told her army that they would win or die. The Romans threw their javelins. They held the defile. The British charge broke against the Roman shield wall in the narrow ground. The legionaries advanced in wedge formation. The Britons, compressed in the funnel, could not retreat because their own wagons blocked the open ground behind them. The slaughter went into the wagon line. The families watching from the wagons died with the warriors. Tacitus gives a Roman casualty figure of 400 dead against 80,000 Britons. The numbers are inflated for Roman audiences. The disproportion is real. Boudica survived the battle. She did not survive the year. Tacitus says she took poison. Cassius Dio says she fell ill and died. Both agree she did not live much past Watling Street. No grave has ever been found. Folklore has placed her burial under Platform 10 at King's Cross Station, under the slopes of Stonehenge, under a hill in Suffolk. None of it is real. She is buried somewhere in eastern Britain, and the ground has not given her back. The daughters are not mentioned again in any surviving source, whether they died in the wagon line, by their mother's hand before the battle, by their own hand after it, or were taken by the Roman victors and sold into the slave markets the administration set up in the years that followed. No document records. The 2 named heirs in Prasutagus's will, the 2 girls who had been pushed through a door in their father's compound while their mother was flogged in the courtyard, walk out of the historical record in the wagons at Watling Street. Suetonius did not stop with the battle. His reprisals across East Anglia in the months that followed were so severe that Tacitus says they would have finished what Boudica had started. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed, the Iceni faced famine engineered into their territory. Catus Decianus, the procurator whose seizure had started all of it, fled to Gaul during the revolt. He did not return to Britain,